Are you encouraging brain drain? Are you even patriotic? Why not do a win-win scenario? Help them help themselves of lower income cohort. They will likely repatriate some or most of those funds, which will also help Malaysia. Right? It's a very counterintuitive way of thinking, but it actually works.
There is merits to it.
Like, it's actually okay,
Yeah. Welcome. This is the new episode of Economy Rise. I'm Hardish.
And I'm Aaron.
And as you know by now, our tagline is for the Economist In You. So Aaron, maybe you want to give a little bit of background to what we're going to talk about today.
Right, so today we actually are going to talk about a recent headline. Khazanah Research Institute encourages brain drain. And this is a very, just say it's a controversial topic.
Right.
Because the context is that the government has been trying to avoid the opposite, right, which is brain drain.
Yeah.
And now KRI seems to be encouraging brain drain.
Right,
so what's the context for this? Maybe Hardish you can help us.
So I think first of all is, this whole idea of a brain drain versus brain gain, right? And I had a look at the report as well. It's quite interesting, right? We'll go a little bit more into the details of what they actually cover. But just at the surface level, when you say brain drain, I think that's something that a lot of people can associate with. Let's face it, a lot of parents nowadays also, if they can, they encourage their children to maybe, go overseas and stuff like that. So that is brain drain, right? It's basically from the perspective of Malaysia, we are losing talents overseas. My understanding of brain gain is that actually it's from the perspective of the receiving country. Right? So that means if you live Malaysia and you go and live in Singapore, for example, like just say you become a PR in Singapore, right? And so then you're working there, you're becoming economically viable in that country. It is Singapore that is gaining it, right? So it's like two ends of the same equation. One country loses, so it's the drain, and then the other country gains it. So from their perspective, they are the brain gain. But I think the issue here is that Khazanah seems to have defined it slightly differently, right?
Yes. So Khazanah actually did use the word brain gain, but it's different from the way it's colloquially recognized. So let me just read to you how Khazanah actually defines it. I'll try and summarize. They say, instead of trying to prevent emigration, many governments are now exploring ways to leverage their diaspora communities for national development, reflecting a shift towards concepts of brain gain, brain exchange, brain circulation to better manage migration flows and serve the national interests. So in this case, they are using the reverse definition of brain gain, right? Because like you said just now, brain gain is the same as brain drain, but from the receiving country's perspective. Whereas how Khazanah is defining it is that brain gain is we send other people out and then we bring them back and then we get brain gain. So it's like an opposite definition of how it's normally used.
So but my understanding is that they are sort of suggesting that this could be a new policy, right? A new consideration, right? Yeah, your thoughts on that as a policy, right? I mean, how would this even work?
I mean, the easiest, forgive me for sounding maybe a bit bad, but the easiest analogy to draw that most Malaysians are familiar with is your Filipino maids or your Indonesian maids, right? So for their countries, they send their population overseas to work and the funds are repatriated back to the country. And that's a form of brain gain, right? Because it's a service sector job and you are, the country that sends the population out is benefiting from it, right? It's very different from how we think about brain drain. So obviously, I don't think Khazanah is trying to encourage Malaysians to be maids.
Khazanah Research Institute.
Just
to separate that from Khazanah National.
We can just call it KRI, right?
Okay.
So just to be clear to everyone, this is not actually Khazanah. It is their spin-off think tank called Khazanah Research Institute. KRI. So KRI is not trying to suggest that Malaysians do what Filipinos are doing and go out and be maids, right? But where they're coming from is really more in terms of like high-tech maids. Right? So think about us going out to do IT, and then or maybe semiconductor stuff, right? Stuff that we are uniquely trained for because our population has good English, we have decent understanding of rule of law, the culture with an American business landscape is also somewhat similar. So we can become these high-tech semiconductor maids for these high-tech semiconductor firms. You could even work for Tan, right, the Broadcom CEO, the richest paid CEO in the US recently.
Is he a brain gain in that sense? You see again
I don't
to
see how
Malaysia.
he's bringing it back though.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think it's a very important, very interesting topic for us to cover later, right?
Yeah.
Like how
Yeah.
it could actually be implemented in an
Yeah.
effective way.
Yeah.
You know, if you need a stereotype, high-tech maids, you know?
Yeah. So I think the setting here is important, right? I mean, like, why are we even having this conversation? Or why was this a policy, or at least proposed as a policy consideration by the report? And I just want to give some sort of background to this, right? And it's really got to do a lot of economic data. So if you look at the actual report, which again we encourage all our listeners, just go and download the report. Like many reports, it's free. Prior to this, we talked about the World Bank report as well. But we also know that a lot of people tend not to read reports in full. So that's what we are here for, right? We will help you with the at least the top level stuff. So it's a pretty extensive report, but Aaron, I'm just going to pull out a few key things, right, that I think sets the stage.
Right.
So what really stood out to me was that if you go back to 2010, right, what the report says is that 60.8% of fresh graduates. So, right, basically 60% of our population, right, who are graduating, going into the job market for the first time, right, 60% of them earned 2,000 or less.
Right.
60% earn 2,000 or less, okay? And that is 2010, right? So now when you look at 2021, it is 59.6% who still earn 2,000 or less.
Right.
So basically, actually, it doesn't move, right? I mean, you're talking about from 60% to 59.6%. It's literally just a difference of 1% over this whole period from 2010 to 2021.
Yes.
And I think that's what drives a lot of our conversation online when we talk about issues like cost of living and stuff like that. So relatively more than half of every fresh graduate that's coming out from universities, bear in mind, parents have paid for their tuition fees. Many of them are going to private institutions, right? Even if they don't go to private institutions, you go to public institutions, there's still this hope that you get a good job and you therefore are on your way for economic prosperity.
Right.
But more than half of them are earning 2,000 or less. And it has not changed over this entire period, right?
So just to do a bit of calculation for the audience, right, that equates to about earning roughly 5 ringgit extra per month. So, if you are already earning less than 2,000 in 2010, today, you are more or less likely to only have increased your salary by 5 ringgit a month. Right? And that is terrible.
So that was a separate point. So there's one about the first time job seekers, right? So fresh graduates.
Right.
But then there was also a point, which is what you're talking about, the average age in any case, right? The average wage, not average age, the average wage of the bottom 50% of everyone, right? All our wage earners only went up by 56 ringgit a year between 2010 to 2019, right? So that's what you're referring to, lah.
Yes.
So in simple terms, if you earned, say, 50,000 a year in 2010, in 2011 you earned 50,056 ringgit.
Yeah.
I mean, it feels quite painful, right?
Yeah.
When you look at the data.
And actually, there's another data point, which is that 70% of Malaysians spend all of their salary only for basic needs, right?
Yeah.
So actually, we did some look into it, and it seems that this is not too far from the average. So just for everyone's benefit, the OECD.
So you're talking about global average.
Global average, yeah.
Right, okay.
The global middle class represents about 50% of the population. Okay. So why do I bring up global middle class? Because this 70% would likely not be in the middle class, right? If you're in the middle class, you tend to have a bit more aspirational budget spending. So if this 70% is spending all of their funds or their earnings on just basic needs, they are likely not within the middle class.
Yeah.
So going back to the global population being 50% in the middle class, something that is a bit of an outlier is that Asia as a region is underperforming slightly on 50% of them being in middle class, which means maybe closer to 70%. And you gotta remember, right, most of Asia is in China.
Yeah.
China obviously has been doing a bit better, right?
Yeah.
I think it's actually not unfair to say that 70% of Malaysians being not in the middle class is actually fair.
Yeah.
It's actually average.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
I guess, okay, so that's looking at it from an economic data point of view, right? It's like, it's just it's not. If I could put it this way, this problem is not exclusive to Malaysia,
Yes.
right? But nevertheless, people are real, right?
Yeah,
So they
yeah.
have real lives, and so at the same time, looking at these numbers, we got to balance it with the fact that we have to acknowledge that it is a global issue in many countries, right?
Yep.
A lot of countries are struggling with this, which we will get into in more detail.
Yes.
But at the very personal level, it also feels like people really are struggling, right? The bulk of your money goes into just meeting basic. It means that I don't know what it says about being able to plan for a better future, a better outlook, right? Because
Right.
you're constantly every day you're just really meeting your needs for today and tomorrow. Right?
Yeah.
But anyway, okay, so that's the background to all of this. As I said, it's a really good report. I encourage our readers to go and download it and have a look. Given that, so coming back to this big topic about brain gain or brain drain, right?
Right.
If we were to even, let's just say your government were to even explore something like this, right? What would such a policy really look like? But if it was implemented by the government.
I mean, the immediate analogy would be something like a JPA scholarship, where you send people over,
Yeah.
but you bond them for what? Is it 2 years, right? Something like that.
I'm not sure actually.
Okay, but you bond them for
Yeah,
at least 2 years, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
they will come back, and then after working here for 2 years, they have less incentive to leave the nest.
Yeah.
Something like that might work, but keep in mind that JPA is an education
Yes.
context, right? KRI is suggesting brain gain in the concept of a work, right? More
Yeah.
adults working and bringing something back. Other than what the Philippines is doing, I'm not really sure how that works. It has to
Yeah.
have some sort of immediate repatriation
Yeah.
concept.
Yeah.
And the way I might think about it is that they are perhaps not really thinking in terms of high tech industries, right? So maybe send someone out to Dubai to do a bit of construction work, right? And typically, if you are in this 70% cohort, you would need to send money back
Yeah.
for your family's living expenses. So then there is an active repatriation. Right? I feel like maybe they could be catering more towards the lower income cohort, right? Because from a middle income and above cohort, I find it quite difficult to convince people not to just stop your stuff, your earnings overseas, especially with the new repatriation tax, right?
Yeah. If I may broaden this a bit, right? Just to, honestly, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, right? As a conversation, I'm wondering whether also this is because we've sort of run out of options, right?
Right.
So when you look at it, okay, so first of all, we acknowledge the data and the lived reality of people. So I think there's no contest there, right? People are struggling, right?
Yes.
I also just want to say that if you are angry at the government, I can't answer to that, but as you mentioned also, like a lot of countries face the same problem, right? Now, if you look at what has been happening, and we've covered this in all the previous episodes, please look at the episodes we've done. There have been various ways that the government has been trying to address this, right? So there's likely going to be subsidy rationalization. There was this, pandemic withdrawals, and now also you have this new account tree and stuff like that. But whatever it is, given all that, it still, I think, has not moved the needle significantly enough, right? So maybe this is some way of acknowledging that, look, maybe we just have to be willing to forego this idea of membership, what it means to be living and working as a citizen in a country, and be a little bit more loose with our talent, right? And how our talent sort of attracts value, right? And so therefore you're being a bit more flexible with allowing people to leave, which is very counter to most of how countries do it, because they
Yes.
actually want their talent to remain, right?
Right.
So yeah, that's the only way I think of this, that maybe it's come time to really start looking at totally out of box ways of approaching this lah.
So in that tangent, I think that what Khazanah is just saying is don't do the opposite, right? Like we used to have this opposite concept of anti-brain drain at all costs.
Yeah.
And given how our domestic economy hasn't really increased on a unit basis, might be time to look at other options, right? But does not necessarily mean that they are encouraging brain drain.
Yeah.
Right, the way the newspapers are,
Yeah.
right? Because if you actually read the report, the actual PDF report, right, there is nothing that suggests them saying that, okay, we need to do brain gain.
Yeah.
Right? They are just saying maybe we should think about the opposite, right? The alternative. Because that might be helpful if the goal is the well-being of the individual.
So what I find interesting in this is because typically, and we, again, in all the previous episodes, the reason we picked some of these topics is because it becomes very hot online, right? So this one also, I think there was a tendency to read it as, if you were upset with the situation or upset with policies and stuff like that, then you are now like saying, see, even an official party is saying that we should allow, right? At least that's how some of the reporting has been put out.
No, I think it's very important to recognize that newspapers are incentivized to do clickbait, right? As a headline. Like, I feel like a lot of people just read the headline without double checking the reports, right? And that may lead to an inaccurate or things being taken out of context. So, just going back to this, right, there's definitely a lot of outrage around Khazanah purportedly encouraging brain drain when that is not really where they were coming from. Right? It's just a third party taking something to make it sound interesting for a different incentive, which is clicks and ads, right? So it's important to keep that in mind.
Okay, any other points in terms of how a mechanism like this will work? So like, for example, like you mentioned JPA, right? And I like, to me, the counter to that would be in JPA, as you mentioned as well, that is an education element. So in education, it's like you are sending someone overseas to get qualifications for various reasons. Number one, maybe that particular type of qualification, we don't have the expertise within our current borders, so we send them out, we pay for their scholarship. But of course, in return, naturally, as the person who's paying for the scholarship, you want the value back, so you have a bond and come back, right? So that is like a baseline mechanism that I think a lot of countries also do. But to turn it into something where it's really related to the talent themselves, right? It feels like one creative way is that you allow people to go out and work, but on the condition that, like the same way you have to make contributions to like EPF and stuff like that, like, some of your earnings overseas, right, you're mandated to like, pay into some sort of or repatriate or something like that, right? So that you are really getting back some of that value. But enforcing something like that would also be very contentious, So I think there's no view here in terms of how the policy will be implemented, right?
If you want to talk about potential creative ways to do it, you could be sending someone to work overseas at a Malaysian company, which is JVing or joint venturing with foreign company. So
we come back to Broadcom.
No, Broadcom is actually, yes, but Broadcom, at least the CEO has some patriotism, right? We're talking about people who are completely over.
He can do a big solid by hiring, say, maybe, 5,000 engineers, right?
No, okay, here's the thing. Okay, I want to purposely not use Broadcom to really clarify the lack of incentive for them to help us, right? So let's say you go for work for Intel. What the Malaysian government could do is set up some sort of joint venture in a particular space of the semiconductor sector with Intel. Then they fund the fees or whatever costs are involved for the employee to go overseas, right? And from the country's perspective, you break even on your own expenses, right? You make your money there, whatever. Then there is some sort of arrangement where, since you are actually just working for a Malaysian company stationed overseas, right? And maybe that's a bond that you have to sign as a condition for going over. You have to come back after 2 or 3 years or even 5 years to work for the same Malaysian company but domestically. And maybe even with a condition that you get the same pay, right? So that is something I could see working from the perspective of the finance ministry. How do you allocate the funds to bring semiconductor talent back? And you have to remember something that normally when controversial changes are being suggested by government or think tanks or policymakers, it is one of two things. One, it is a test to see how it might be received. Or two, it is a way to ease people into the actual objective. So this might be just part of a master plan. And if you think about what sort of sector might benefit from such talent offshoring, it's obviously semiconductors, right? Think about people who work in Pahang or Terengganu, right? If you could get them to join the Penang semiconductor node in a Silterra kind of fashion, I think that would be immensely profitable for GDP, right? So we're just being creative here,
Yeah. Actually, just on that note, just something to add on, like we talked about earlier in terms of how the starting salaries have not really changed, and it's probably about 2,000 for 60% of our our fresh graduates. Right. But there is an exception to this. If you were to go into the semiconductor industry, especially at this current environment where there's a lot going on, there's a lot of investments and all that, you actually stand to make easily between 3,500 to 4,000 as a starting salary.
Yes.
And I know this because I had a conversation with a very young Malaysian who actually was is working in this industry. So 4,000 as a starting salary is quite compelling, right? But because of the huge talent crunch, they still get much better offers overseas.
Right.
So it's not really related here, but I just wanted to share that in terms of there are industries that
is, because now that you bring this up, right, it makes me think that could this be a way to if the talent is going to flee, right?
Yeah.
Can we at least try and benefit from it?
Yeah.
Something like that, right? Because how do you compete with Singapore, for instance?
Okay.
Right?
Okay, so that's interesting. So I will go into a little bit more in this conversation. So the young guy, right? So he's earning pretty decent, and I asked him about his friends, and he said that they all left, right? So bear in mind, the semiconductor industry pays pretty good in comparison to all the other industries, right? So I asked him, why did you not leave? And so, it's a cultural thing. It's familial ties. So because of that, it's more of the emotional connection that becomes the deciding factor about whether to leave or not.
Okay, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Is he from Penang?
I'm not sure. Probably.
Okay.
Right. But the company he's working for is not in Penang.
Okay.
But it's still semiconductor, right? So like now they're also like moving to Johor and all that. So if that were the only pull factor at the end of it, right? If you put aside all the money and all that, you balance out the economic benefits. If the only thing that is the final deciding factor is whether you want to stay back or you take a smaller pay, even though if it's higher than average, but it's because of family, culture, maybe food, right? That becomes very, I think, almost challenging for the country, because like what else do you have to offer?
Right. I think it's also worth mentioning here that there's a difference between someone who goes overseas and then comes back after they retire.
Yeah.
And someone who is actively repatriating funds while they are working.
Yes.
So I think what KRI prefers is the latter, not the former.
Right.
Because the former, you work overseas, you consume overseas, and you come back precisely when you are not contributing to the economy.
And you become a liability.
Yes.
Right.
Sorry, right?
Yeah.
So what KRI is suggesting is the latter, right?
Yeah.
And I think going back to your Penang, that guy example, so there are two parts to it, right? One is that what I was saying earlier, where he leaves the country because there are better opportunities abroad, right? Maybe what KRI is suggesting is if he's going to leave anyway, why don't we somehow try and institute some sort of policy where we can benefit from that?
Yeah.
Because there is no way Malaysia can pay the same wages as Singapore or the US.
Yeah.
Could that be what they are trying to achieve?
Possible, right? I think so. The challenge here is that as a research institute, I think is more of looking at the data, and then from the data you sort of play out what the scenarios are, and that kind of informs what the possible policy implications are, right? But generally, I think research institutes don't propose policies, right?
They actually do. So they actually propose the imported rice subsidies being removed, right? And that's actually what happened.
Yeah.
So I do think KRI's, or at least think tank's job partly is to recommend policy.
Okay, if that's the case, then I think maybe they could have gone further in terms of really thinking through the mechanism, right? Because based on this report, I think it was more in terms of just the idea that we have to rethink this, right? Which is like the first level. Actually, I agree. I think maybe, what would be more beneficial is to have an actual mechanism in place. It may not be perfect, right? But you put it out there just to at least get some conversation going, right?
Let me try and frame it in a more relevant perspective. Basically, what we are suggesting is that KRI's recommendation is less for the middle income and above, and more for the lower income.
Yeah.
specifically the 70%, right, that they actually did mention, who are living hand to mouth, who are spending all of their take-home pay on just basic needs. What type of jobs would we see them doing, which might be different from what you and me consider as status quo? Like if, for instance, as a middle income person, I would imagine them sending me out to do a semiconductor job. And we have already kind of explored how that might not be relevant. But if I were lower income, let's say I'm earning 2,000 a month, right? And I have the opportunity to go overseas in Singapore, do the same job, and earn 6,000 a month. Right? And maybe repatriate 4,000 of that back. From the nation's perspective, that would be immensely better. Like literally double. Right? So let's try and put ourselves in the shoes of KRI. Okay, and let's be clear. Let's try and encourage it. What kind of policy would you as a policymaker implement? Like what type of jobs? Okay, let's just go there first.
Okay, in terms of jobs, to me, I think the easy one is care economy, right?
Actually, it's quite interesting. We saw that one of the fastest growing sectors is yoga, right?
So, and I think this is really interesting. So I want to make the distinction between maids, or let's use the word helpers, versus care economy, right? So yes, so what you're saying, so just for some context to our listeners, right, there was a separate report that was put out by PwC that looked at, okay, the context is different. This is in the age of AI. What are the jobs that are sort of in demand? We won't go into it in detail, but what is of interest here is that if you think that the jobs, the skills that are more in demand right now is IT skills, you're wrong. Actually, it's the care economy. Right? It's things like services and stuff like that.
And let me just add a bit of context there. It's because the global population is growing older.
Yes, correct. So I think there is a real opportunity for us. For example, if you are in a lower income, you could possibly upskill yourself in becoming like a carer, right? So care economy here will be taking care of elderly, working in care homes and stuff like that. But not just that, it's also like, as you say, like yoga instructors and stuff like that. And you possibly could go and work overseas, and with, Malaysians are known for hospitality. Like, you would have the human element, you would have the skills, and the cost of upskilling in this industry, I'm going to say, is probably lower, right? It's more cost effective, let's use that, right? Because you don't need to spend 3-4 years to have a degree, right? You can do a certification. I think that becomes very compelling. Like we could really benefit from this, because many of these other countries, they cannot meet these needs themselves anyway. Right?
So I think we actually have a very good point in support of KRI's direction. Right? Keep in mind that the context is everyone is angry about them encouraging this. Whereas now we are making the case that it is possible that it could actually be extremely positive for the country. So imagine if you are in this 70% cohort of people who are maybe frying goreng pisang, right, in front of your house. You could actually go overseas, work for in European country like Spain or in Japan, where the population is growing older. They need more carers, and you could go there, earn maybe 4 times more what you would earn here. Keeping in mind that working as a carer, you will earn more than frying goreng pisang at home, right? And on top of that, you benefit from the differential in the currency. Then you would inevitably repatriate back at least what you used to earn. Right? So from the country's perspective, it would be highly beneficial. And to describe it in purely surgical terms, it would be because there is too much supply in the country, right? Where we have not enough demand from industries to tap this potential. So why not send them overseas, right? To their own benefit as well as their families, and to the benefit of the country. Because anyway, we don't have enough demand to support them. Right? And it's 70% of the country, right? Just to be fair, that is not saying that our country is underperforming. We already explored the statistics. But it's still a very significant portion of the country, right? So why not help them and help us at the same time? It's win-win. Don't you think this is super different from what the presumably middle class status quo is angry about?
I think from that view, a way like I would summarize it is that we actually have excess human capital that we actually could export to our benefit, right? And so therefore we should economically exploit it lah.
Yeah, so actually, I just want to digress a little bit.
Yeah.
I have a friend who recently told me that he has been invited by a big company overseas to build care centers here. And the way it works, which I actually don't really understand the business model, is that they see that houses become too expensive. So you will contribute an insurance premium. So this is an insurance company throughout your working life. And then when you retire, you would get access to the whole suite of welfare services, right? Where it includes a home, it includes insurance for your health, and also your typical, uncle, auntie, badminton classes and stuff, right? Then when you die, all the assets go back to the company, but your retirement is secured.
Right.
I think the world is really moving in this trend where the global population is getting older.
Okay.
And there is a greater care economy.
Yeah.
And where this is relevant to KRI is that care economy is uniquely labor intensive. You cannot automate it. You cannot industrialize it.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
It has to be done by humans.
Yeah.
And so China is also facing this problem, right? I can see how tapping our excess supply of human capital can be very, very helpful. In fact, one of the ways to describe brain drain from the receiving country's end is human capital flight. Right?
Yeah.
So it's literally human capital that we are benefiting from.
Okay.
I think something else we can come back to is obviously a lot of people are very unhappy with this, right? Keeping in mind that KRI's words might have been taken out of context, but Adesh, your role on this podcast is the views of the man on the street. Right? So what do you see that people are worried about? And you can feel free to bring in your personal feelings into it.
Yeah.
What do you think about, or what do most people think about Khazanah's encouragement for brain gain?
Yeah. So I think there are two ways looking at this lah. So first of all, let's acknowledge that this brain drain from perspective of Malaysia has been going on for quite a while, right? We all know that, right? I think we all know relatives also who have decided to migrate, okay? And it's a reality, lah, right? And it also makes the headlines all the while. The second thing is that just coming down to the context of this report, fairly or unfairly, I mean, it's people will use this as a validation, right? Because it's coming out from a research institute that also happens to borrow or to share the name with
Khazanah.
Right, Khazanah, right, which is a sovereign wealth fund.
Yes.
And to be saying like this, I mean, personally, I give them credit for maintaining academic independence. I think that's important, right?
Yes.
But they and no one can have any control over how people react to it, right?
Yes.
So I feel like this is almost like an enabler for people who are like, who are always trying to find things to complain about. This really becomes like, a huge,
yes. I know what you mean.
an opportunity, like, okay.
Basically, validation, right?
Yeah, validation, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that aside, so let's come down to the personal side of it. Okay, personally, I have two thoughts on this.
Right.
And this is going to, you can stop me if I get a bit too, I go down too much into this particular track, right? But the way I look at it is that if you go back 2 generations or even 3 generations, a lot of our grandparents or great-grandparents also made this decision at some point.
Right.
They also made a decision to come to this country because of economic considerations, right? So it's very interesting that our generation now is sort of facing the same situation as well. They have this ability to decide whether they want to leave or not. But I feel we have one advantage that many other countries that do this do not have. And that advantage is actually Singapore.
Okay.
Right?
The proximity is
Yeah, the proximity of Singapore.
Right.
So, we were talking about just now, like, think of it as high-tech maids, right?
Right.
But if you look at all the other countries where they sort of, there's economic migrants, right? So they come to different countries to work. And let's use Malaysia in that case, where Malaysia is the receiving country. Most of them have to do it at pretty huge costs. Huge cost from leaving family, leaving their culture behind, coming here, having to stay here for like 3-4 years sometimes, having to relearn a whole new language and stuff like that, right? I think there's a huge emotional toil that you are sacrificing in return for economic benefit.
Okay.
Right? So you do come here, I think it's fair to say you do earn higher, right?
Right.
So it's the exact scenario, but you're doing it at a very huge emotional cost. In our case, there's no emotional cost. If you were to consider Singapore, right, it's actually to our benefit.
Right.
Because you can just commute. The real pain, I think, is you just commute, right? The commute time, right?
mean from KL
if you
to
were staying
Singapore?
in Johor, for example,
Okay.
right? So there are two options, right? There are
Right.
ones where you just commute. So even if you look at the context of this report, is like 70% of our wage earners are barely making it.
Right.
That same 70%, actually, they can work in Singapore. They will get a much higher earnings, right?
Right.
They can still live in Malaysia. They can still maintain their family, their connections and stuff like that.
Right.
But immediately they benefit from having so much higher economic output,
Yes.
right? Or really economic income, lah, right? Or on the other hand, if like you're an urbanite from KL, for example, maybe you actually go and live in Singapore. And again, I have many friends who do that. Probably you do too as well. They complain about the food in Singapore is not as great as in KL.
Okay.
But otherwise, they're earning higher, right?
Right.
So if like, in a way, it's like we have that advantage of proximity where you have an opportunity to actually practice this,
Okay.
take up this option without the same cost that many other people have to do from other countries.
When you say cost, you mean emotional costs?
Yeah, emotional costs, giving up family, connections.
Okay, so how are you framing the question when you bring up these concerns? Is it more from the country's perspective or the individual's perspective?
I mean, at this point, it's purely individual, lah. Because all this while, let's face it, right? Anyone who's making these decisions are making it purely for their personal interest or their family interest, lah, right?
Right.
They're not really thinking about what's best for the country.
Okay.
Right, and I'm not making a judgment, right?
Right.
They are thinking like, okay, I can actually earn higher somewhere. Maybe I'm more qualified, and maybe I don't have as much prospects here.
Okay.
So in my judgment, right,
Right.
I think I'm better off somewhere else. So I'm gonna go and practice that option, right?
Okay. So if I were to throw a question to you, if you let's say your kid, right?
Yeah.
Would you send your kid overseas? Like what? And also try and invite a bit of context from where KRI is coming from.
Yeah.
Right? Like what would your consideration be as a patriot? I can tell
Yeah.
you what the equations might be from a government perspective.
Yeah.
Obviously, this is going to be detached from
Okay.
individuals, right?
Okay. I will attempt the government's perspective.
Okay, sure,
Let me
sure.
attempt
Go
the
ahead,
government's
go ahead,
perspective. And this actually, I do believe this to a certain extent.
Right.
No matter where you are in this country at this point, I think you are a beneficiary of or a benefactor of everything that the country has provided, right?
Right.
You've benefited from it, right? A lot of people probably don't acknowledge that, but even if you're not happy with your jobs today, or this is the current climate and stuff like that, you have to bear in mind that all of us are the outcome of being citizens in this country for the past, like say 20, 30 years, right? And there is a cost to government and society,
Yes.
right? That cost has already been incurred, right? And I think we sort of write off that cost without really thinking about it. Right. So for someone like me, for example, my primary and secondary school, public school, right? But my university was private, but it was local private, right? So of course, I benefited from public schooling, and then university. Okay, I mean, I got my first degree and stuff like that. Where I differ from a lot of my friends and peers is that I actually am quite thankful for what I've gained from this country. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that is not great about it, but I think it's similar in many, many other countries as well. You pick your battles, lah, right? But I think just to wrap up where I come from from a government point of view, you could say the government has a right to be upset because they do invest in the infrastructure, in the services and stuff like that. It might not be perfect, but it's still so much better than many other countries.
Or maybe
right?
I clarify what I mean by government. In terms of policy structuring, right? Like, what are your opinions about how it relates to the individual, and also how the individual might feel? Like let's say if you were being asked to do that,
like
less about how these people feel and more about actual economic impact.
Yeah. I mean, if you're talking about this, trying out a policy like this, I think it'll be a very hard sell.
For most
For
individuals.
most
right?
individuals. I think it'll be an extremely hard sell.
So put yourself in the shoes of one of those 70%
Yeah.
who are living hand to
yeah,
mouth.
yeah.
Would that be an easier sell?
Yes,
for you?
but
You'll be earning 3 times more in Singapore.
yeah. So
I'm not trying to.
yeah. So the argument here is that look, the government first of all has to say, okay, we acknowledge there's a problem here.
Right.
We let you go out, but in return, you do a certain amount repatriated or whatever, right? We're not sure what the details are. I think that's doable because you have to make the distinction between this 70%
Right.
who probably would not have the opportunity to migrate
Yes.
versus the 30% who probably can afford to migrate, right? And because they already have the skills and stuff like that. So I think there's a difference there. So therefore, that higher end of it is very hard for them to justify because their view is that I've done this all myself. Why do
Right.
I need to give back?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we've covered pretty much everything here. Do you want to maybe just summarize everything? I mean, the context remains that at the top of it was that there was this at least a very what was perceived to be somewhat controversial recommendation, right? But we think that it's something worth considering, lah. So
Yes.
I'll just let you summarize everything that we've covered if you want to.
Right. So the summary is basically this. Initially, KRI's intention was perceived for us to become high-tech maids. And that would actually lean into the narrative of, are you encouraging brain drain?
Yeah.
Are you even patriotic? Whereas where KRI might actually be coming from is a good place. We've already explored the economic statistics, whereas 70% of the country
Just scraping by,
yes.
getting by.
And the country, unfortunately, is not able to accommodate them,
Yeah.
right? Or help them. So why not do a win-win scenario where there is actually a possible way for win-win, right? One, help them help themselves. And two, they will, coming from the 70%
Yeah.
of lower income cohort, they will likely repatriate some or most of those funds, which will also help Malaysia.
Yeah.
Right? It's a very counterintuitive way of thinking, but it actually works.
There is merits to it, lah.
Like, it's actually okay,
Yeah. So that's this episode, and I think if I could just add on to that, what we try to do whenever we take up a topic is to maybe shed a little bit more light on it. Hopefully, that's the value that we add to our viewers, right? Because increasingly we see that there are going to be a lot more of these contentious issues, simply because we have to deal with it as a society. But I think there's not enough of quality discussion around it.
Yes.
Right. So we hope to at least play a small part in sort of contributing to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Basically, just bringing the truth so that people will be less angry.
Yeah. So if there are other reports and if you're too lazy to read it, you just send it our way. We will do the hard work. And then we will summarize it in about 40 minutes of video. By the way, this is the Economy Rise podcast for the Economist In You.
And if you enjoy this kind of content where we help you summarize difficult economic matters, please follow this channel by liking and subscribe.